Because all ancient cultures agree that there was an event that occurred many, many years ago that changed the shape and the face of the earth. And they are united in agreement that this was a great flood. Every culture has a great flood story. Most of us are familiar, by name at least, with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest recorded flood legend. And again, I use the term legend instead of myth because it is grounded in fact. Now, Gilgamesh was not a nice guy. And the story actually has very little to do with the flood, except for one excerpt where he encounters this immortal who was saved from the flood by a Babylonian or Sumerian god. And he recounts this story to Gilgamesh. But you also have, after Sumeria, you have the Babylonian, you have Hindu, Greco-Roman, Chinese, Norse, and Native American flood stories. All of them dating back to this one event, this cataclysmic event that changed the world. And you can look all these up. If you were to look up, for example, China, you would be able to find in their legends and history, because they kind of blur the lines a little bit, you would be able to look up their version of the flood story. So these are all verifiable. And so it seems a little presumptuous to call these flood myths when every culture agrees on this one aspect, and that is that this did happen. One explanation of this that has been put forward is that in all of these regions where you have this flood story is that there is massive localized flooding. And so you have the flooding of the particular area where these stories originate from, but not a flood that covers the whole world. Can anyone tell me why that is a problem? Which, by the way, those things that he mentions, those are included in every flood narrative. The animals, the building of the ark-like structure. I think in Gilgamesh it was a giant cube, I think is correct. Yeah, which doesn't make sense because everybody would have died when the cube tumbled through the ocean. But anyway, they didn't think that far into it. But the ideas are the same. There's a massive structure that's built. All the animals that could be brought on are brought on, and they're saved, and the people inside are saved from this massive cataclysmic event. So I guess you could make the statement that this idea of localized flooding really doesn't hold water.
I don't disagree a little bit. I think the biggest thing is we can't question that.
Oh, well, agreed, yes. Sure.
So sure. I can't see where somebody would say, hey, the localized makes sense, and then you can go in with, well, was there literally enough water on the earth to flood the entire earth? And I've read where a lot of scientists say, no, there's not enough water to flood the earth to that degree. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. There was a flood out of control, and I just can't accept that.
And that is that's an interesting point, and there are some things that to your first point, we have to accept that God's in control, and we have to accept what the Bible says, to your first point. And so if the Bible says that the earth was covered with water, if as Christians, we have to accept what the Bible says in that. And so I think that we, in effect, can minimize God's power if we go down this road of, here's a scientific explanation for what actually happened when it comes to the flood, because this idea of the whole earth being flooded is not scientifically possible. But there is a point where science ends and God begins. And so while I'm not going to take a stance saying that the idea of localized flooding doesn't make a certain amount of sense, but I am going to take the stance that the Bible says what it means and means what it says, and we have to grapple with that in some way, shape, or form. But you do bring up an excellent point that I did want to discuss. And by the way, this is all being covered in Genesis chapters 6 through 8, and that's going to be the text. We will be jumping to different parts of it, but I'm not going to read it verse by verse this morning because we have all read this before. Yes, ma'am.
We don't have any way scientifically to prove that everything came from nothing, and yet that can be accepted by a lot of people, that there was this goop that turned into life, that turned into all the things. And so it's really, even from a scientific standpoint, you have to be careful from saying we can't prove, because there's a lot of things we can't prove that have been accepted into various.
And to that point, I am going to make the statement that I believe that we can prove there was a global flood. And we're going to get into that. But the first thing I want to look at before we get into the flood actually happening is Genesis chapter 6, verses 18 through 22. And I want to cover this because this becomes important when you look at the moral meaning of the flood and the metaphor that exists here. If someone would read for me Genesis chapter 6, verses 18 through 22. All right. Now, this is where I'm going to give some credibility to, what's your name, sir? Ryan. I'm going to give some credibility to Ryan's argument. Did 2 of every animal end up on the ark? We'll get to that, but I want to start with just did 2, at least 2, because I know the verses following this identify 7 of every clean, and it seems to indicate 7 pairs of every clean versus pair of unclean. Right. But my question is, did every animal end up on the ark that existed at the time of Noah and the flood? Mm-hmm. So my argument to you, I'm sorry, go ahead. Every living thing of all flesh. So then let me ask you, I'm going to present a question. And again, I am not going to disagree with the Bible. The Bible says what it says. I'm not going to disagree with it. But I am going to present a question to you to get you thinking. If every living thing that was on the earth at the time of the flood made it onto the ark, what about the dinosaurs? If you don't hold to the 1,000-year day version of creation and evolution, and the dinosaurs were wiped out and then man came, and that's a whole other theory that we discussed several weeks back. But if you hold to the 7-day creation theory, and you hold that the earth is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old, if you hold to these ideas, then dinosaurs would have been on the earth at the time of the flood. Well, so I would disagree with you with that in that, and we will get to that. But I understand what you're saying. But so my question is also, did that break out into species as well? Was every species of animal, for example, we have different species of tigers, different species of lions. We have different. Right, reptiles in specifically. And if you want to get into some of the more interesting creatures described in the Bible, Isaiah makes mention of a word that is translated in the King James, unicorn, which at the time probably meant some kind of rhinoceros-like beast, I think is what we have determined on that. But it is a beast that we no longer have on the earth today, in addition to other creatures that are mentioned there. Job makes mention of the behemoth and the Leviathan. As best we can tell, we don't think that these creatures exist anymore. And unless I'm mistaken, the common belief is that they were wiped out during the flood. The common Christian belief. So, again, I know that people don't like it when a teacher asks a question that they don't intend to answer, right? And I'm not going to attempt to answer that question. But if every living thing or a sample of every living thing made it onto the ark, then why do these creatures not exist anymore? Particularly when you're talking about apex predators that more than likely would not have been wiped out had they made it off of the ark and back onto the earth. Now, I'd be interested in perspectives on that. Mm-hmm. You could, and
They're reptiles. They're eggs. I mean, there's lots of. I don't know. It's not my favorite area to study, but I have read a lot about it.
Sure, I'm interested. Yeah,
It's interesting to see these areas because it's all conjecture.
It is because we don't have the answer. Yeah.
If you were to bring two large, massive. By the way, I've even seen people talk about. Well, let's try to figure out how many different types of dinosaurs we found. Let's measure their size to their largest size. And let's talk about how large this boat is. It is a massive structure.
It is, but is it that massive?
I've seen that argument, but I've also heard the argument that, you don't have to bring them all as full-grown species.
That's true. That's true. So what is the size of the ark? Does anyone remember?
But there has also been mention, a lot of people, when they talk about the feasibility of putting all these animals in the ark, they are thinking of, like, zoos, which a zoo is for keeping an animal in it for essentially its life.
Yes.
Right? That's not the ark.
No.
The animals were in the ark for 1 year.
Correct.
And it's an emergency situation. So it's not really that they have to be comfortable and not even particularly fully healthy environment. It is an emergency situation for them to live in for a single year, and then they are back out in the wide world again. So when we talk about feasibility of the ark, we also have to keep in mind the purpose of the ark. It's not for them to live indefinitely until the end of their lifespan. It's for them to survive an emergency situation for 1 year.
Right, it
It
is.
ends up not needing an extreme amount of space.
And yeah, there are a lot of different arguments about what happens to the earth during the flood and after as well. There are arguments about how the atmosphere changed and the earth would not support the same type of life that it supported prior to the flood. There are arguments about that.
It all
If-
comes down to people want to deny the miraculous.
That is absolutely correct.
It's almost silly trying to argue either God can perform miracles or he can't perform miracles. I mean, I've heard every argument why the crucifixion didn't really happen, the Bible says it happens. And it's all comes down to the fact that I deny the virgin birth, or I deny crucifixion, or I deny. You're either in for a penny or in for a pound. Can God perform the miraculous or can he not?
I agree.
If the dinosaur's on the wrong continent, can he move the dinosaur wherever he wants it? Can he change the weather to whatever he needs to be? Is he the creator of everything or not? Do we accept that God or do we not accept that God and the Bible's full of a bunch of myths?
Well, spatial relations don't really fall outside of God's purview, right? We have the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, right? And they fed how many people? And so we know from the New Testament that God can manipulate time and space as he needs. And so that is another, possibility. Yes, ma'am.
I also think the question assumes the breadth of animal kingdom that we have today, which is not necessarily fair.
Absolutely true.
In the creation account, we all ascribe to it was a 24-hour day, and Adam had enough time in one day to name all of the animals and
Sure.
find that they weren't fit for him, and then God created woman. And so it is not likely that there were as many different kinds of animals as there are today. And then on top of that, like we don't ascribe to macro evolution, but we do ascribe to micro.
No. Adaptation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we
Mhm.
have seen, many of us in our lifetime have seen animals change over time. And we have new kinds of dogs and new kinds of this and things have.
100%.
And so to even the question about, well, what about the dinosaurs? We have documentation that dinosaurs existed well after the flood. And so a lot of it, I think, is we're asking the wrong question because we're assuming based on what we know today, which we can't necessarily do going back.
And it's difficult. Exactly. It's difficult. And like I said, I did not pose this question with the intent of giving you, well, this is the answer. This is the source from where I get the answer. It's just a question that I think is important to ask because it's not clear, right? It's not given here. What is given is the statement that 2 of every living thing of all flesh will be brought onto the ark. And so you kind of wrestle with these things because does anyone know how big the ark was? We've mentioned it's huge, right? Does anyone know how big it was? It's mentioned right here in this passage. 300 by 50 by 30. And that is cubits. And a cubit is about 18 inches, give or take, because they were not exact in their measurements, but roughly 18 inches. And so if you're looking at 300 cubits, you're looking at something like 450 feet. All right, just to give you some perspective on how long the ark was. It was a massive structure. But, the question still remains, is that large enough to get every animal on there? Well, at some point, and I hope that we get into talking about this because we're running out of time, but at some point, it becomes a matter of faith. So at some point, you have to have a measure of faith to trust that the Bible says this is what happened, and our choice is to choose whether or not we believe it. And that is faith. Yes, ma'am.
I do think part of that is having the wrestling with the question through logic.
Yes.
And we were given logic. Logic is not something.
Yes.
We're not meant to just look at things and throw out our logic. And I think it is important to ask the question because God gave us logic.
Yeah. Sure.
But at the end of the day, it is some measure of supernatural. And we either believe it or we don't.
And, even more specific than logic, God gave us reason. After the age of reason, right, and the Enlightenment period, Christians kind of began looking at reason as a bad thing. But it's not. Reason is a gift from God that we are to use to sort through these things. But it has its limitations because there are some things that you just can't explain through logic or through reason. The resurrection of the dead, right? A dead man coming back to life logically does not make sense, and yet the Bible tells us that it happened, and the Bible is not the only recounting of those events surrounding specifically the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ is identified in multiple sources, not just the Bible. And so, whether or not it makes sense logically or reasonably, our faith leads us to believe that this happened. And the same thing is true of the flood to some extent. But there have been a couple of mentions of some things that I wanted to address. Specifically one, well, what about the animal on this continent? Or what about the animal on that continent? So I wanted to look at something, number one, about what the flood looked like when it happened. And number two, what the earth looked like before and after. And that's going to be Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 and 12. And if someone would read that. Genesis 7, verses 11 and 12.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of that month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
Okay, so we've all heard Noah and the flood story, right? It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, that's a lot of rain, but is that all that is described here? No, it's not just rain. And again, there are many different theories about what the earth looked like pre-flood. The one that I'm going to speak of with relevance to this is, again, a theory called the canopy theory, in which at creation, the waters were separated, right? One above the firmament and one below. The reason I bring that up is because what is believed based on that theory is that the canopy surrounding the earth that was water is what flooded the earth at this time. So it was not just a rain, it was the collapsing of this canopy. And again, that is a theory. But the other part of this that I want us to look at that never gets discussed really when you're discussing the flood is all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Science now tells us that there are fountains in the deep, beneath the earth's crust, that exist. And that it is a tremendous amount of water under a tremendous amount of pressure. Now imagine what it would look like if these things called tectonic plates shifted drastically all at once across the globe, and these bodies of water that exist beneath the tectonic plates all exploded out into the ocean and onto the land. Just take a minute to picture that in your head and picture, number one, how violent it is, and then combining with the waters coming down from the sky in torrential downpours. And just imagine how drastically and how quickly the earth would change.
There's an official name for that theory. It's called catastrophic plate tectonics theory. If you ever want to look it up.
Yeah.
And it really does make a whole lot of geological sense for that to happen, because there's all of this material. You mentioned water under this fault line, which is the Atlantic fault line.
Right.
Water fountains of water underneath this fault line, but not at the surface. So the plates essentially moving out of the way,
Right.
it would result in an explosive event. And
Yes.
really, I do mean explosive.
Right.
There's all of these different kinds of minerals that have been found that are essentially rocks with water molecules trapped inside them.
Yeah.
And when they are depressurized, they explode.
Right.
Right. And so the plates being moved out of the way, all of that pressure releasing. First, all of that pressure releasing is going to shoot water out of the way. But all that pressure releasing from those minerals also is going to cause them to explode as well. And if you're thinking about it phenomenologically, which means how something appears, it would appear as though there's just this huge water fountain in the middle of the ocean just breaking open and bursting up into the air.
Right.
It would look like that. And so even if it's not literally a fountain under the ground, that is what it's looking like. This event happened.
And violent. Like if you wouldn't want to be close to this, because you're talking about, the equivalent of violence of like a nuclear bomb going off in the ocean. Yeah, right. So I don't want to minimize that, but it would drastically change the face of the earth. So science believes that at some point, millions of years ago, there was a supercontinent on the earth called Pangaea. And this is all, speculation, but it is possible that if there were a continent pre-flood that existed, because it says that the land was separated from the water in Genesis 1. Doesn't say whether there were multiple continents or islands or just one mass of land, but if there was, and the earth drastically changed during the flood, because it wasn't just waters that happened. If you get into this account of what the fountains of the deep bursting open would look like, it would change the face of the earth. And so you might get, for example, multiple land masses where you only had one to begin with. And again, this is all speculation, and it does dabble some into science and some into biblical account. But it would be possible for an event of this magnitude to change the face of the earth that drastically.
And even if you want to take the stance that these other land masses existed,
Sure.
you wouldn't have to have, you wouldn't have to justify Noah getting to these land masses and pulling it off of them, because the Bible doesn't say literally every creature. It says every kind of creature.
Right.
Every sort of,
Right. And there are translational questions about that, because in Hebrew you have, we have the English translation of this, but in Hebrew you've got like one Hebrew word that is translated as a whole phrase in a lot of these situations, and Hebrew is kind of difficult to parse out. And so the exact meaning, it may not be every creature, was put on the ark, but it could, for example, be every type of creature or something like that.
And like Captain mentioned, we do not have anything that indicates that the taxonomy of creatures before the flood was anywhere near as diverse as
100%.
now. Because you have to understand that the earth has existed after the flood far longer than it has existed before the flood.
Yes.
If you count out the years, the flood happened, I think I did the math, I think it was around 1,600 years after the earth was created, the flood happened.
Mm-hmm.
And we have been going from that point 4,000 to 6,000 years. So life has had more time to diversify after that bottleneck event than it has before.
And to that point, if you follow, the creationist line of thinking, the fact that life has diversified on the earth so quickly almost refutes this idea of evolution, which it takes so long life to diversify on the earth. We're talking millions of years, whereas if you're looking at 6,000 years and we've gone from the earth being all but wiped out and then populated and the species being diversified to a massive scale.
And it actually does not take that long for the speciation to happen.
Agreed.
Because every time that you have a group of animals getting, sectioned off from each other because of geography or whatever else, you get a speciation because you have genetic bottleneck. And it takes a couple of generations for it to happen. There is an example of, it happened in, River State. It's one of the states out west.
Mhm.
There's a lot of wasteland, pretty much. And there was a weapons test that blackened a huge portion of the ground. And you had field mice that are living in this area. And now there are tan field mice that live outside of the blackened area. And there's black field mice that live inside the blackened area, because if the black field mice go outside, they get picked off by birds of prey. But if the tan field mice go into the blackened area, they get picked out by birds of prey.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you have a group that is only black and a group that's only tan because of a very simple environmental factor.
Mm-hmm.
It's can you imagine in 100 years, these two groups are going to be so genetically different at that point.
Right.
That they probably can't interbreed, and even if they did, they would probably die.
Right.
It wouldn't happen. We've got two different species.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening in the course of a couple.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. They would die out. And on a larger scale with that, you look at dogs versus wolves. That's originated from the same species, are now different species. Catherine.
Something that I sometimes kind of think through is we, especially with science, what science looks to do is to observe. What can I see? And so sometimes what science is doing is observing something, but we can't make an observation and then know for certain in every case why that happened or how that happened.
Agreed.
And I think that, Pangea, the whole theory of Pangea, I think that makes a lot of sense from this story.
Right.
And science cannot observe that this flood happened. They can observe the ramifications.
The effects, correct.
The things that happened. And so sometimes, again, it's which question are we asking? And sometimes we're asking the wrong question because we're well, I see this, and so it can't have been supernatural because there are.
Right, we rule that out. Yes.
But
yes.
Because we can observe the result of a supernatural thing doesn't mean the supernatural did not happen.
Well, and to that point, you know, in the effort to explain a supernatural event as a natural event, you have to add things. For example, eons of time, right? To make this happen. For example, some of the animals that were petrified during the flood, right? And now when they go to carbon date these things, they're saying, well, this one's, you know, 135 million years old. This skeleton's 135 million years old. Because that's the only way they can explain how that skeleton became petrified in its state, right? And Grant knows more about that than I do. He's done more research into it. But bringing the class back on track, so there was a huge change in the earth at this time, and it could have had a trickle-down effect into changing a lot of things, including the way the earth looks, the canopy surrounding the earth, the animals that were on the earth. And then, of course, in Genesis chapter 8, as we move through that, are there any questions or comments in addition to what has already been said regarding Genesis 7 and the beginning of the flood? Oh, yeah, no, yeah, 100%. But anything for the benefit of the group. Not just nerding out over the flood, which I love to do, so I'm there with it. So then you have Genesis chapter 8, where, you know, after 40 days, the rain ceases. They're on the boat for a period of time. And then I think it's about 150 days before Noah sends out the first bird. And he sends out a couple of birds, and the dove comes back with the olive branch. And, you know, we know the story. And then the second dove doesn't come back. And then eventually you have the rainbow, which is the symbol of God's promise, never to flood the earth again. Now, it is about time for class to end. And so next class period, we'll get into the implications of the flood and the effects and how it affects us today and what it means to us today. Thank you for your time. Well, no.